somewhere soon. Or Happy Trails had their downsides.
Yeah. Very nice, clean style. I'm not sure we want to go through the entire 100 pages of it, but
there's a fellow here named McQuay who will let us buy a piece of land on credit, the New Hollands Land Company. It was a hotbed of religious activity, much of it devoted to a better society without war or desire for wealth. We in our colony have no sexual needs or activity. We worship the woman of the wilderness. Okay, the Quakers achieved a peace settlement with the Seneca tribe, which probably didn't last. So much for the Quakers, it looks like they're on the outer. Back at the trading post. Chief corn planter made peace with the government in 1791, giving his people a small reservation. If we run out of food, we eat butternuts. And if we bore into the sugar maples, we get sugar. Someday soon, though, we whites will cut down the trees for timber and use up the game for food. The wild game, nuts and berries, and even the fish that supported Indian life, all these are already diminished. Indian lives will be finished here. Other Christian groups also rejected violence and even competition. John would have heard of the Shakers and the Mennonites. So some were pacifists and faced the Indians and got shot. So one guy lost his son for some 20 years or something with the Indians. Right, Jacob's child had lived with the Iroquois for 20 years.
Yeah, that happened a lot.
This is an important story of non-violence and forgiveness. We refuse to hate. Very idealistic. The New Jerusalem. Okay. Here are my great-great-grandparents, family. A lot of them were in the Swedenborgian church back in the 1840s, 1850s.
Yeah.
Near Manchester.
Yeah, it was interesting to learn a little bit of the background of Swedenborg and Swedenborgianism. I didn't know, so that was cool.
Well, it's curious. This was an age where people were discussing spiritualism, basically, and the idea of living on the heavenly plane after death. All of which, in the method they were talking about them, was stuff that probably would have ran them into trouble prior to the late 18th century. The change seems to have occurred sometime in the 18th century. People were delving into matters which would have normally been, put on the heresy shelf. What was his name? Lessing's famous work, The Education of the Human Race, which came out around the 1770s, 1780, was again another work which would have in earlier times had him classed as a heretic, but became one of the great philosophical bases, well, led directly to Hegel, although Lessing's work was very short. Hegelianism was an extension of it. Swedenborg himself, that was interesting. Of course, he came from Sweden, but spent a lot of his time in Holland and England. He was a great scientist, well, regarded as one of the great scientists and technicians of the 18th century, but seemed to have changed his ways and become a spiritualist from a certain point onwards. And so he wrote these quite lengthy works on spiritualism. And he was under investigation in Sweden for heresy. So it was fortunately for him, he could spend a lot of time in Holland, England, which was a much freer atmosphere. These religious movements grew out of movements like the Pietists. For example, when the Protestants' religion was created, very quickly it became a state church. The idea of the individual having a free choice in all matters was very quickly removed. And of course, some felt that was a cheat, like the Quakers. And the Pietists were on the continents, and their idea was true Christianity is your private community meeting in somebody's house. So Sweden banned, beyond I think an immediate family, banned any type of Bible reading or religious service in the private home. And that ban officially remained until the 1850s, causing a lot of Swedes to leave. Well, this included Norway as well, because it was part of Sweden. And if you watch these old style films like The Immigrants, which is about Scandinavians immigrating to America, it probably doesn't mention it, but most likely a lot of them were pietists, seeking religious freedom. The New Jerusalem, yep, that was it. They were all hoping for a better world. On the changing frontier, of course, we not only had the religious pacifists, we also had every type of crazy you can imagine, of which the modern American crazy is probably a much milder form, which I know is hard to believe, but it's quite likely. And of course, alcoholism was widespread, and this was a thing with the apples, that Appleseed was spreading apple varieties which were really generally only good for making apple cider and apple cider vinegar and Applejack. Now, today, I wouldn't be able to buy Applejack. So if anybody wants to join me in an imaginary business venture of starting up an Applejack line. Yes, Matalio.
Are you saying that most Christians are purists or Puritans by nature? That they're mostly pacifists?
Well, this is your what do they call it? Non-conformists. Broadly, the term they use is the non-conformists. And there was a state church. The state church were the Anglicans. And that was the same in the US as well. You know, if the president consulted with anybody, you weren't going to get a non-Anglican president up until a certain point in history, I suppose. You might have got at some point a Methodist or something like that. You had movements which were against the state church, and they believed that they had the right for their own democratic form of Christianity, and many of these were pacifists.
Yeah, like Paul Tillich, I think, is one of the important figures. I haven't really studied him that much though, but Yeah, he rejected fundamentalist Christianity and embraced the democratic one instead. So it's clear that there was a division in the doctrinal loci.
Well, Wesley was a famous one.
Mhm.
He separated from the Anglican Church and began the Methodists.
Yeah, okay. Is that to say that all evangelical Christian denominations are pacifists, though?
Well, it's going to vary, I suppose, but the evangelicals were a new thing that started in the 19th century.
Hmm.
The pre-evangelical nonconformists, by angelical, talking about, say, thinking about what have we got there? The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists, and that was a new thing which started up in the 19th century.
Hmm.
Vegetarianism. That was many of these groups were devoted to vegetarianism.
I mean, because I just did a bit of a study in the schisms that occurred within the Roman Church in that, and I think it just gives me the impression that the popes and whatever the patriarchs is very flawed. I mean, like a lot of these theological debates within the Catholic Church was just so centered around politics and cultural conformation. I did a study on the division of the Western Church, the Latin Church, and the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, and it just makes me realize like how, I don't know, how corrupt, like even like the so-called divine authorities can be in making their decisions just to stabilize their territory, their country. But it just makes me think like if that actually defines the whole Christian movement, or it just contaminates it. I mean, the Roman Church sort of just seems like it contaminates the idea of Christian purity and pacifism. I mean, this is an opinion. I mean, it's probably just a lot to do with people so much more than God or Jesus.
Well, the rise and fall of the Roman Catholics. I suppose, if you could follow a sociological history of the Catholics, they changed over time. The Pope had originally been under the thumb of the Eastern Emperor until a certain point when he got the Franks to become the new empire, the new Western emperors, and very soon, within a couple of generations, you'll have Pope Nicholas. You were reading about him.
Yeah.
Who claimed that he ruled the entire church. Every Christian church in the world was under his thumb. He's no longer the first among equals. He's the Lord. Nicholas, I think he was Pope from 860 until 867.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran into trouble with the Patriarch of
Yes.
Constantinople, Photius, was it?
I think Ignatius, and then Photius was appointed patriarch after Nicholas was deposed. I think so. Yeah, that's what I could recall.
Well, Nicholas died before he could be deposed.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
It's
Okay.
the ultimate way out for samurai, isn't it?
But the weird thing about Photius is like he was also deposed at one point, but he was reinstated again because the patriarch of Constantinople died. I think that was Ignatius who died. Yeah. And then it just got worse somehow after Photius. Um, uh,
Well,
regarding
the fascinating turn of events was that the Western Church and the Eastern Church in the end didn't ratify it and rejected it, was the idea that human beings do not have an individual spirit, that a human being is body and soul only. And because of that, there is only one path to the spirit, through the auspices of the church. Whereas the Eastern Church rejected that. And so in the Eastern Church, we had a lot more spiritual mysticism, where people felt that through their own devices, they could get into a divine contact.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, this is a big one that David might be interested in, is the rationalism aspect. Is basically the Western Church said human beings have a body and a rational soul. So the Western Church decided that the soul was a rational being. And this is the move that the West moved very strongly towards the idea of rationality. And viewing a human being as a rational being is true, but when you view them purely as a rational being, that's very limited. What was still in the Eastern Church, what was in the Hindus, was the realization that human beings and existence and the cosmos is very complicated. It's not something that is so easily generalized, but the Western Church said, no, the individual, the only thing that's greatly mysterious in the universe is God, but the rest can be rationalized. So the human individual can be rationalized, the world can be rationalized. For example, the Catholic Church did not believe in witchcraft, did not believe that individuals could obtain magic powers. They certainly persecuted witches for heresy, but not for having magic powers. So in our great age of rationalism had its birth in the Catholic and the Protestant churches who inherited the Catholic tradition, was that the rational individual, rational earthly individual, that's the limit. And of course, the humanists, who later on the secularists, who later showed on, simply continued with the Western Church tradition minus the God. And hence today, what are our humanists? Absolute believers that rationalism is the be-all and end-all of everything. What would you say to that, David?
I have a bit to say to that. In fact, one of the humanists that I was on the phone with, so I think he belongs to the Secular Spiritual Care Network in Victoria, and he's part of the humanists though, so part of Les Allen's organization and that. So
right, I know them.
Yeah. So he told me that, we just want to be more inclusive, I suppose, because the Christians sort of like this care network and that sort of organization. It's not as inviting.
An example is that they do chaplain work on a secular basis.
Do they?
Yeah, well, that's where they really started off, was the secular humanist chaplains for the dying, for example. So they'd visit hospitals and visit sick people and dying people.
Oh, this is more about like helping people undergo like changes having to do with like, with no faith, maybe like gender transitioning or that sort of thing. Without the need to have Jesus's ministry aid you.